Chapter 12. Constance was carrying flowers. On the way to Hillside, she had stopped the car and bought flowers. She guessed that there might not be too many flowers. Perhaps not even enough to cover Mrs. Clark's coffin. There was a card attached to the flowers. On this card, Constance wrote, "In memory of Mrs. Clark." She needed to sign the card. For the first time she realized that she did not know GD's name, his family name. Yes, that was Ndlovu. What she did not know were his first names. In the office, among all the staff at Tembisa and Associates, and so to Constance herself, he was always known as GD. "What are your first names, GD?" Constance asked. GD rubbed his nose and pulled on his right ear. Constance smiled. "Come on, GD. Have you something to hide?" She often liked to tease him in this way, just right. "Put down GD Ndlovu," he said. Constance smiled and did as he suggested. Once they were in the motor car, Constance made no effort to start the engine. She looked at GD again and smiled. "Tell me, GD. What? Your names. Why is it so important?" he asked. "Are you ashamed of your names?" "No," GD replied vehemently. "Then tell me," Constance urged. "I'm your friend, aren't I?" GD shook his head, sadly. "Why do you laugh at me?" he asked. "I'm not laughing at you, GD," Constance said, gently. "As your friend. We are good friends, aren't we?" "Yes," GD answered. You're the nicest person in the company." "Well, as your friend, I'm curious," Constance said. "We're going to a funeral," he said, trying to change the subject, "and we ought to be serious." "Life goes on," Constance told him. "I'm sorry about poor Mrs. Clark. But life can't stop because one person dies." Constance thought about Mrs. Clark. She seemed to have been a woman with very few friends, and hardly any relatives. Certainly not relatives who lived in the city. Constance had arranged for a large wreath of flowers to be sent as a mark of respect from Tembisa and Associates. There would probably be flowers from Bokiti and Jacob. Perhaps some of the neighbors in Hillside would send flowers in memory of Mrs. Clark. It was important that there were enough flowers to cover the coffin on the journey to the cemetery. When Constance and GD arrived at the house in Hillside, the doors were locked and there was nobody there. Not even Jacob and Bokiti. They looked through the windows. In the front room there were flowers. As Constance had suspected, there were not many though. "Where do you think they are?" GD asked. "Who?" Constance asked. She was not really concentrating on what GD was saying. Her thoughts were somewhere else for the moment. "Jacob, Bokiti, and Mrs. Clark," GD replied. "I think they'll lie down at the funeral parlor," Constance said. "The chapel of rest. When people die, the body may be kept at home until the day of the funeral. In some cases, the body remains in a special place and is collected just before the funeral takes place." GD. "Can you break in?" Constance asked. The messenger was taken completely by surprise. What? They had come to pay their last respects to an old lady who had died. And now Constance was suggesting they should break into the house. "Why?" he asked, looking at Constance. There were times when he found it hard to understand her. I've got a feeling," Constance said. "What do you mean?" "Don't ask me to explain," Constance told him. "Trust me, GD, trust me." She walked round to the back of the house. GD followed her. He sighed. The last thing he wanted was to get into trouble. Breaking and entering was a crime. There was already too much of it in this city. The police arrested people every day. In the courts, the magistrates were tough on criminals and thieves. If anybody should know this, a lawyer like Constance Majolo did. "I have a feeling," Constance said, as she checked every window. "There's something I've missed. The answer is probably in the house. Among those papers under Mrs. Clark's bed. If only we can get into the—" "Let me see," GD said, almost pushing Constance to one side. Within a short space of time he had found a window where the catch was not very strong. Forcing it open was no problem at all. They were at the back of the house. This part could not be seen easily by neighbors. Constance climbed in first. She had to be helped a little bit by GD, but very soon she was inside. The messenger followed her. He knew it was wrong to enter a house in this way, but once inside he felt more secure. Here they could not be seen by neighbors or people passing by. The first thing that they noticed was the strong, beautiful smell of many flowers coming from the front room. They went into that room. There was a large wreath from Tembisa and Associates. The card which was attached to the flowers was signed by both Peter Tembisa and Mrs. Maribi. There were other flowers from people whose names Constance did not recognize, neighbors, probably, she thought. There was nothing from either Jacob or Bokiti. "Keep a lookout," Constance said. Her lookout. GD asked, "Tell me if anyone comes," Constance said. "So we can climb out of the window again," GD said, and there was sharpness in his tone of voice, because he knew very well that if anyone came they would be caught instantly. And then he added, urgently, "Let's get out now. While we can. Try to find a key," Constance said. "Then we can say the door was open and we came in to sit down." In her voice there was irritation. She was sure that she was close to the truth about this whole business and GD was wasting valuable time. Why worry about such little things at a time like this? GD sighed again. He heaved his shoulders sadly. Yet he went to search for a house key. Constance went into Mrs. Clark's bedroom. She entered the room slowly and carefully, as if she expected, or almost expected, to find the old lady's body stretched out on the bed. There was nothing in the room, however. Constance looked round. Then she knelt down. She lifted up the bed cover so that she could see clearly everything that was under the bed. Everything was as before. The metal box was there. The lock was still broken. There were papers inside the box. Most of them seemed very old. There was a smell of decay about them. Like Mrs. Clark herself, these papers from the past had remained in this room, holding secrets. GD searched for a key. It was important that he found one. Then he really could claim that the door was unlocked when they had arrived so that they could not be charged with breaking and entering. He even closed the window again, so that nobody would know how they had got into the house. The longer he searched, the clearer it became that there was no spare door key in the house. He found other keys and even tried some of them in both the front door and the door at the back of the house. None fitted. Very soon he was becoming worried, more worried than when they had first broken into the house. After some time, GD went to tell Constance he could not find a key. He was going to persuade her that they must get out quickly again, while they still had time. He peeped round the door of the bedroom. Constance was kneeling down. Many pieces of paper were spread out on the bed. Constance. What? Constance did not even look up at GD. She was completely absorbed reading the papers spread out in front of her. Some of the pieces of paper were so old that they had yellowed with age. Just like leaves from a tree that have fallen and are dying. "I can't find it," GD said. He was whispering. Constance was absorbed in reading the documents. She was not paying attention to GD. Let's get out of here," GD pleaded. "If..." Constance turned to look at GD. She had been going to get angry with him, but when she saw his worried and honest face, she chose softer, gentler words. "Keep searching, GD," she said. I've almost finished." This was not really the truth. In spite of a careful search, she had not yet found what she was looking for. The problem was that she did not even know what it was she was seeking. A search can be difficult even when you know the object of the search, like GD searching for a duplicate house key. For Constance, the major problem was that she had only a feeling, a suspicion. Nothing more. No hard evidence. As a trained lawyer, like things to be clear. In a court of law, only evidence is admitted. Opinions, gossip, hearsay, rumor, vague feelings, none of these would do. But Constance was not at this moment in a court of law. She had a feeling, and she knew that she was right. When she found the object of her search, then all would be made clear. This was not a case in court, relying on evidence and facts. This was, she felt sure, a matter of the heart. In such areas, feelings and emotions are everything, hard facts do not count for anything at all. GD continued his own search for a key. By now he was certain he would not find one. Lai knew they must get out of that house and do so quickly. Yet it was difficult, impossible even, to persuade Constance. She seemed to have no fear of what would happen if they were discovered. When they were discovered, that was what would happen. His fears were soon realized. 2 black vehicles came slowly along the street. In the front one there was a coffin. On the coffin there were 2 wreaths of flowers. There was a driver and, in the passenger seat at the front, a second man. In the second vehicle 2 people sat at the back. GD could see everything from the window. He sighed heavily. The 2 people were Jacob and Bokiti. In the front seat of the second vehicle there were 2 men also. Both cars turned right and into the pathway of the house. It was too late now. GD could not warn Constance. All he could do was inform her of the arrival of the funeral group. They here, GD told Constance sadly and quietly. Constance looked very unhappy. She had failed to find what she had been searching for. GD looked out of the window. Jacob and Bokiti were out of the car now and were walking slowly towards the house. Bokiti was dressed in black. Her face was covered with a black veil. Jacob was dressed in a black suit, white shirt, and black tie. These were their mourning clothes. The 4 men who had accompanied them opened the back door of the hearse, the vehicle in which the coffin was carried. They pulled out the coffin and, walking slowly, carried it towards the house. At that moment, another motor car entered the driveway of the house. A man wearing a dark suit got out of the car. La was wearing a white collar turned back to front. There's a minister of religion, GD said, to conduct a service, Constance replied. She was thinking fast. They might yet be lucky. It was plain that both Jacob and Bokiti were feeling the deep sadness of their loss. They might not even notice that neither GD nor Constance should be in the house they had locked earlier. When people are in mourning for someone they have loved, such everyday details are not considered important. The grief becomes a mask, nothing else is noticed. That, Constance thought, was their one hope. She too felt sadness. The woman she had been talking to only a few days earlier was now in a coffin. Soon, Mrs. Clark's body would be committed to the ground, or possibly to flames. Constance did not know whether it was Mrs. Clark's wish to be buried or cremated. She had not included any such request in her last will and testament. They heard a key turning in the lock of the front door. I failed, Constance said to GD. You tried, GD told her. You tried very hard. He too was feeling the heavy hand of sadness on his shoulder. It doesn't seem right, Constance continued. She was talking to herself almost. It did not matter that GD was there listening. It simply doesn't seem right. Daniel should be here. He should be here to pay his last respects to his mother. Bokiti was hardly able to walk. Constance took her by the arm and led her to an easy chair. The coffin was brought in by the 4 men and placed on a table. The flowers from the sitting room were arranged all round it. Only one wreath was placed on top of the coffin. Constance stared hard. She was fighting to keep back her tears. It was very hard to remember that in the coffin was the body of Mrs. Clark. About one thing at least Constance had been right. Jacob and Bekiti were so grief-stricken that they had not noticed the intrusion of Constance and GD. The minister of religion said prayers. Then he spoke about Mrs. Clark and gave thanks for her life. Bekiti wept, her veiled face wet with tears. Jacob stood up as straight as he could, but his body was shaking with emotion and grief. Outside, a group of neighbors and others had gathered. When Mrs. Clark went on her last journey, she would be remembered by more than the small group inside the house. Finally, the minister of religion said a last prayer. Then he took hold of Bekiti's arm and helped her to her feet. Bekiti stood beside the coffin. Then it was Jacob's turn. On his face there was grief but no tears. GD looked at the coffin and then turned away. Constance did not move. GD touched her gently on the arm. It was important that Constance be seen to pay her last respects to the dead woman before they moved away. Constance went forward. Bekiti and Jacob were already on their way outside to the funeral car. The four men waited to carry the coffin to the hearse. Constance touched the wreath of flowers. The wreath was made of red and white roses. There was a card attached. These were the only flowers on the coffin. Constance read the label attached to the roses. She read the words. She said, "Am I blind?" She hurried outside. GD was waiting by Constance's motor car. "GD. You travel with Jacob and Bekiti," Constance told him. "Why?" "Just do it," Constance said urgently. I can't just get into their car," GD protested. "This is a funeral, not a wedding." "Please, GD," Constance said, almost pleading with him. "Please believe me. I know what I'm doing." Constance could not move her own car until the others had gone. She had been the first to drive up the path and so would be the last to move out. The cars lined up in the road. The small crowd of neighbors was silent and respectful. The first vehicle was the hearse, carrying the coffin with Mrs. Clark's body in it. The second car was the black limousine in which were Jacob and Bekiti. The third car was the one in which the minister of religion was traveling. He had come in his own car. He had other duties to attend to later. Constance went to talk to this man. She spoke quickly. Time was short. "Where are you going?" GD asked when Constance came back to him. By this time he was thoroughly confused. "Get in the car with Jacob and Bekiti," Constance ordered. "But trust me, GD," Constance urged him. "I know what I'm doing." She ran to her own car, started the engine, engaged gear, and was soon speeding down the road. GD stood for several seconds, his mouth gaping in surprise, before finally joining Jacob and Bekiti.